We're learning the laws of brachos, of blessings, from a text that the Alter Rebbe wrote, the founder of Chabad. And we're basically finishing the second chapter. I think we did enough of learning about amoitzi and not amoitzi, different types of breads and so on. So let's move to chapter number 3, which is a very interesting chapter about blessings, of course. And basically what we're going to learn is what happens when you eat, which is very common. I would say it's the most common case, different types of food in the same meal, even in the same plate. Like you don't eat just one thing, you eat things mixed with other things. And what happens when they have different blessings? Which blessing do you make for that particular food, which is a mixture of different foods? So the Alter Rebbe says like this: when you have a mixture of two types of food, all mixed together, and their blessing is not the same, if one of them is the main food and the second one, you just put it there to give it some taste or just to fix it and to make it nicer or whatever. So you make the blessing for the main one, and that blessing already is enough even for the second one, which is the secondary food of that particular plate. That's the general rule is that ikar v'tafel, if you have a main plate, a main food in your plate, a main type of food, and the second type of food, which is secondary, you make the blessing for the main one. You don't make the blessing for the second one. You don't do that. And now we have to understand what really means something main type of food and secondary type of food. But that's the general rule. Now, if you have, second law, if you have some grain means wheat and barley and those kinds of grain mixed with the food, then this food that you're eating is called mazon, something that sustains you and fills your belly, and that's automatically called the main thing. Every time you have grain mixed with your food, that's the main thing. Always. Because even if most of the food is, for instance, honey. So you have some kind of cookie with honey inside of it, and you have a lot of honey and a little bit of grain, like the cookie around that, or any other kinds of things, like for instance cheese or whatever. But even in that case, where most of the food is something else, for instance, you would say shiakol niya bidvaro for the cheese or for the honey, that everything was created with this word. And you would say, boy, the mina mezaina is that God creates all kinds of sustenance for the grains. But you have more, again, honey or cheese than grain, you still make the blessing on the grain, on the flour, whatever, the cookie thing of the grain. Even if you're eating this thing, whatever you're eating, because of the honey or because of the cheese, your main intention by eating this is because you want to eat cheese. But you don't take the cheese with your hand. It's not nice. So you put a cookie around of it or whatever, something. And it's just this grain that you're putting inside of it or on top of it, whatever, it's just to make it, to prepare it, just to make it nicer, whatever. See, still the grain is the main thing. And you say, boy de mine mezainos. In Spanish, there's something called empanada. Empanada means something with bread around it. Even if it's a very thin layer of bread, that doesn't matter. This is the main thing, and you say, boy de mine mezainos. And as we learned many times, the blessing after the food, even though for Jews would be this blessing that is divided in 3, that includes bread kinds of things and pastries, whatever, or wine or the 7 fruits of Eretz Israel. For non-Jews, you should not say this bracha, doesn't make any sense. So you just say, that God creates all kinds of souls and their sustenance and so on. However, if you don't have the grain itself, you just have the taste of the grain, I'm not sure what kind of food this would be, but you don't have the grain, just the taste, then you don't say mezainis. The taste doesn't fix the kind of bracha. Imagine today we have essences of different kinds of food, so you can put just a liquid, two drops of liquid, and it tastes like, but it doesn't have that thing. So you don't say the bracha of that thing that it tastes like. No, you just say the bracha of whatever you're eating, the blessing of what you're eating. Okay, let's move on. All of this applies if you put the grain over there to give it taste or for other kinds of things. But if you just put it there to give it color, for instance, I don't know what kind of grain would give color, or you put some flour just to put it together because otherwise this thing would melt or something like that, then it's not really the main thing. So, in other words, what would be the rule? You make a bracha for what you're really eating for the sake of eating that thing, not for the sake of putting it together. No, that's not you're not eating it for that. Even today, in the industry of food has all kinds of chemicals, all kinds of things. You could put things that you're not even conscious that you're eating that thing, and you're still eating it because the industry put it just to give it color, or just to put it together, and so on. So you don't make the bracha for that thing. And that applies, law number 4, that applies if you don't really have the intention of eating the grain. However, if you have the intention of eating the grain, even if it was not the main thing, like you don't intend to eat the grain. You put the grain just to put it together, just to put the whole thing together. But you still want to eat the grain, that becomes the main thing. So grain is like on top of the pyramid of foods, so to speak. You have to make the blessing on the grain. And he brings an example over here of something he calls leikach. Literally, it's written lekuch. Leikach is like cake. It's like a very, very sweet cake made of honey. They eat this on Rosh Hashanah and these kinds of times of the year. So over there, most of the cake is sugar or honey, and you put some flour because it's called cake, but the main thing is honey, and it's a very, very sweet thing. You still eat you make the bracha for the cake, because it's still called a cake. The grain is still there, and it becomes automatically the main thing. Of course, when I say grain, I don't mean the grain itself, like the seed of grain. I mean the flour mixed with water and so on, but that comes from grain. Then in law number 5, I don't know what this food is called, and the Alter Rebbe also doesn't mention it, but it's an interesting type of food. If you have a sweet thing that is made just to enjoy something sweet, and you mix flour, grain flour, very little amount of grain flour with sugar and flour of almonds, probably pretty tasty. And there's a lot of flour of almonds, a lot of sugar, a lot of honey, whatever, and just a little bit of regular wheat flour. Even though you have it becomes a very thick dough, a very thick mixture, and you put it in the oven, and it looks like a piece of bread, literally. You still make boire mina mezainis. It's not called a bread. Why? Because people would not eat this as a meal, as a regular meal. Because the reason you eat this is just for the sweetness of the thing. It's very sweet. It's very pleasurable, so to speak, to eat this thing. Unless you fix yourself to eat this. What does that mean? You invite somebody and you would say, okay, let's sit together and let's spend time together talking and let's eat this. This is going to be our meal. We're not going to eat anything else. Then you would say a moitzi on that thing, even though it's so sweet and so on. However, if you have a bread that is made of a mixture of wheat, for instance, wheat flour, and flour of legumes, I don't know, for instance, there's something called algarrobo in Spanish. It's a tree that produces it looks like a banana, but like brown banana, and inside of it has like seeds. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai used to eat this outside of the cave where he was. I forgot the name in English. Whatever. Okay, so yeah, over here you have a mixture of flowers. You have flour made of wheat and flour made of other things. Since this kind of bread, and it's still a salty thing, like in the previous law, we were talking about a sweet thing, almost like a cake. It looks like bread, but if you taste this thing, it's really sweet. And in this law, we're not talking about something sweet. We're talking about something that you would eat with cheese or with meat or with something else. You would eat it like that. Still, what's the novelty of this law? That there's a mixture of flours over here. It's not just wheat flour. That would be complete bread. But over here, even though you have another flour, still, since people fix their meals on this thing, then you say a moitzi for this thing. You say that God takes bread out of the earth and like the regular bread. Even if you have a small amount of wheat flour, even so, you still make the blessing as if this was a regular bread. Like with this with these laws, the Alter Rebbe is showing us that wheat flour usually is the main thing, even if there's a small amount, unless you're talking about something very sweet that people would not eat in a regular meal, this thing, unless you make it your main meal. That's what the Alter Rebbe is saying. There's always an unless. Okay. Number 7. If you have a dough that has something inside of it, could be meat, could be fish, or could be cheese or fruits, whatever. So you have a dough and something is inside of it. This is the regular empanada, something with bread on top of it. Then automatically, whatever is inside becomes secondary to the dough. And it's enough to make the blessing on the dough independently of the blessing of whatever is inside. Now, this dough, depending on how it's done, you could say a moitzi, or you could say mezoinos, depending on the kind of dough that we defined in the previous chapter. But whatever blessing you make on this particular dough, that's enough for whatever is inside the dough also. You don't need to make a blessing for what is inside. With the blessing on the outside, it's enough, because the outside is dough, like a regular bread or mezoinos, whatever. Even if afterwards you're going to eat the thing inside of it by itself. So suppose you have this, again, empanada, this thing with bread on top of it, and inside of it there's cheese. Suppose there's cheese. So you make whatever blessing you need to make, hamoitzi, that God takes out bread of the earth, or mezoines, that God creates different types of sustenance, and then you want to eat cheese, just the cheese. I had enough dough, now I want to eat the cheese. You don't need to make a blessing for the cheese. You already made the blessing for the dough, and that included the cheese that was inside the dough. And you don't need to be strict and take a piece of the inside and make the blessing for that. You don't need to do that. That would be called a bracha levatara, an unnecessary blessing. And then the problem with an unnecessary blessing is that you're mentioning the name of God without need. So we don't do that. So in other words, I don't remember if we learned this or not, but in any case, the whole idea of blessings, it's a rabbinical thing that our sages instituted to make blessings. Why? Because it's not proper that a person, this is what the Talmud says, not proper that a person benefits from the world without thanking God, without asking permission from God. Okay, different ideas about blessings. However, there's still one of the 10 commandments is not to mention the name of God in vain. So there's a combination of factors over here. On one hand, we do want to say the name of God, thanking Him. On the other hand, say it only when you really need. Don't say it more than what you need. So that's what the Alter Rebbe is explaining over here. There are certain types of blessings that are completely unnecessary, so you don't say them. Suppose you have two things in your plate that the blessing is the same. Boire pri adama, that God creates from the fruits from the earth. I don't know, you have potatoes and you have cooked onions. Both are adama. So you don't make two blessings for that. You make one blessing including the other type of thing that you're eating. Because the second blessing would be completely unnecessary. You could be enough with one blessing. And again, the novelty of this law is don't have in mind not to say a blessing for the other thing so I can say another blessing. No, don't do that. You should not do that. Like take a potato and say, I'm just going to say the blessing for the potato. Then you say the blessing and now you take the onion. I'm just going to say the blessing for the onion. Don't do that. No. Take one of them and make the blessing for both. One blessing for both things. Now, if you just want to eat what's inside of it, you don't want to eat the bread on top of the thing. You just want to eat what's inside of it. Then, of course, you have to make the blessing for whatever you're eating. For the cheese, for the meat, for the, I don't know, the corresponding blessing for what you're eating, the potato. Moreover, says Alter Rebbe, number 8, our sages explained that anything that is a main food and together with it you're eating something that is secondary, you just make the blessing for the main thing and automatically you don't need to make the blessing for the secondary thing. Even if they're not mixed together. Like sometimes you have in your plate like a salad. Everything is mixed up. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have in this part of the plate this food, in this part of the plate this food, and so on. So you're just eating these two things in the same meal, so to speak. Okay, that's fine. So that's why you can make a blessing on this one and automatically accentuate the obligation to make a blessing on the second one. Even if it's bread, as we explained before, that is the most important food and type of food of all foods. For instance, you want to eat a piece of fish. And in ancient times, they didn't have fridges and so on. So they made salad. They put salt, a lot of salt in the fish. So it can, how do you say, it lasted on the time. It didn't get rotten. So now, you want to eat a piece of fish. What's your whole intention? I want to eat this salty fish, really salty fish, very salty. And you just want to eat a piece of bread in order so the salt would not stay in your throat. You pass the fish and then you take a piece of bread just to take out the salt so it doesn't damage your throat. And in this case, the bread that you're eating is a secondary thing to the fish. You're not eating bread because you want to eat bread. You're eating the bread because you want to eat the fish. The fish is the main thing. In that case, you don't need to make the blessing for the bread. You just make the blessing for the fish, and then you eat the bread. Because the bread is completely secondary thing to the fish. This applies to a case if you're not hungry so much to eat the bread. You really don't want to eat the bread. You're just eating it because you want to pass the fish. That's all. You want to eat the fish. However, if you want to eat the bread, hungry in this case means you really want to eat the bread, but you don't want to eat the bread just by itself. You eat the fish and then you eat the bread. So since you still want to eat the bread, then automatically the bread becomes the main thing. And you don't need to make the blessing for the fish. You just make the blessing for the bread, and then you eat the fish. Number 9. If you eat, I don't know if anybody does this, but whatever. If you eat before the meal a piece of bread with wine or with like a very strong drink, vodka, whiskey, all kinds of things like that, these kinds of drinks. Even though your real intention is for the vodka, the whiskey, and so on, but it's very strong and it's very hard to drink it just by itself. So you put a piece of bread on it, and then you eat the bread with the drink. Since you're not within the context of a meal, and therefore, just a second, you're just eating before the meal, and therefore we can assume that you want to enjoy this bread also, because after all, you're preparing yourself for a meal, so you want to eat the bread also, you have to make the blessing for the bread. Even though the main idea was to drink some alcohol, whatever, something strong, and it's because it's so strong, you put a piece of bread on it, we can assume that you also want the bread. Why? Because you're preparing yourself for a meal. You're actually hungry. So this piece of bread is going to fill your belly. Therefore, you have to make the blessing for the bread, not the blessing for the drink. Okay, let's jump to 16. I think it's going to be more practical. This that we learn that the secondary food, type of food, you don't need to make a blessing because you made a blessing on the main type of food, even if the two types of food have the same blessing, you just make the blessing on one, and this goes for the second one also. This only applies when the secondary is in front of you, or at least you had the idea of eating it clearly in your mind when you make the blessing for the main one. But if after making the blessing, they brought to you something that you were not thinking about eating this when you make the blessing, therefore you have to make a blessing for this thing also. However, when you make it after meal blessing, it's enough with just one blessing for both things. You need to make an after blessing for each type separately. Suppose they brought you want to eat apples. You want to eat apples. So you take an apple and you make the blessing. We're going to learn, you take it with the right hand and so on. So you make the blessing and you eat the apple and you're happy. And somebody brings you oranges. And say, oh, very nice. I like oranges also. You were not thinking about eating oranges when you made the blessing for the apple. So you make the blessing for the orange now, and you start eating the orange. Now, the after blessing for apple and orange is the same. So you don't make two blessings after, one for the apple and one for the orange. No, you just make one blessing, and it's enough for both things that you ate. But you ended up making two blessings at the beginning and one blessing at the end. It's not that each beginning blessing needs an ending blessing. No. You just need beginning blessing and ending blessing, but it depends on how you ate and what you ate. It could be more beginning blessings than end blessings. That's what Alter Rebbe is explaining over here. Unless you knew that you were going to eat oranges when you make the blessing for the apple, in that case you don't need to make the blessing for the orange when you're eating it after the apple. Now, number 17 is interesting also. Anything secondary that is eaten after the main thing, it's not nifteres, it's not accentuated from its blessing unless you eat it in the place where you ate the main thing and you did not change your place in the middle from one room to another room. Unless, as the Alter Rebbe is going to explain, but really much later, unless you're eating a kind of thing that fixes the place. What does that mean? Suppose I eat an apple in your house, and then I go to my house and I want to continue eating apples. I made already the blessing for the apple. Nah, you change the place, you have to make another blessing for the apple. And then you just make one after blessing for both apples that you ate. In your house and in my house, just one blessing afterwards. But since I changed the place, I have to make another blessing. Within the same house, usually we don't say you change the place, you make another blessing. For instance, you went from the kitchen to the main room, whatever. You don't make another blessing. It's just your house, it's the same domain, so to speak. Okay, chapter number 4. The things that come within the context of a meal, if these are things that usually are part of a meal, that means that people usually eat within the context of a meal. So you don't make another blessing after you made the blessing for the bread. For instance, you started a meal, and furthermore, you went to somebody else's house. You don't even know what you're going to eat, because whatever, it's not your house. So you started the meal with bread. You made the blessing for bread, amoitzi, and then they brought you whatever, chicken, and then they brought you meat, and you don't make any more blessings. That's it. You just made the blessing for the bread, and whatever is brought to the table that has relation with this meal, and people would eat it in the context of a meal, you don't say a blessing. It's included in the blessing of the bread, even if you didn't have it in front of you. Even if you didn't have it in front of you. Now, I'm just moving forward on purpose to be clear. However, the Alter Rebbe is going to say it later, but however, if they bring you something that is not part of the meal itself, for instance, dessert, they bring you ice cream. Okay, we finished eating the chicken, and now we're going to eat ice cream. Okay, wait a second. People don't eat ice cream to fill the belly. Nah, people eat ice cream because it's nice. I like it. Okay, that's not meal already. That's not part of the meal. You have to make a blessing for the ice cream. But I made a blessing already for the bread. Yeah, but the bread was a meal. You ate the bread and the chicken and whatever because you want to fill your belly. You're hungry. You don't eat the ice cream because you're hungry. Nah. So that's not part of the meal. That's already something else, different. That's what the Alter Rebbe says in the second law. If you're talking about things that do not come to the table because of the meal itself, people would not eat this in a context of a meal, and they don't go together with the bread, and they don't come to fill your belly. Rather, they come for whatever, fruits or ice cream and so on. You have to make a blessing for that, whatever blessing corresponds for that thing. If it's fruits, maybe it could be from the tree or from the earth or whatever. If it's ice cream, it's shiakol ne'abidvara, everything was created with these words and so on. Even if you eat this thing, secondary thing, so to speak, the fruits, for instance, with a piece of bread, and now you want to eat them without the bread, you still have to make the blessing for them. I don't know if people eat really apples with bread, or I don't know. I don't think so. That applies when people brought you, for instance, the fruits in order to eat something sweet, something pleasurable, and so on. But if they brought them to go with the bread, then you don't have to make a blessing before that. If I'm not mistaken, the Alter Rebbe finishes saying, don't practice this, because it's a whole doubt whether you have to make the blessing for the fruit or not. Like, eat it without the bread, and for sure you have to make a blessing. This is an interesting one. Sticks. I don't know if it's common, but it's interesting. If you're eating your meal and you make the blessing, whatever, and suddenly they brought you something, like your neighbor knocked the door, and said, Shalom Aleichem, I brought you this to eat. Wow, you were not expecting this, you didn't know he was going to come. They just brought you something to eat, like a present from another house, and you were not expecting that at all. So then you can't say that this food is included in the blessing you made for the bread. You were completely not thinking about this. Like, for instance, if you have something in your fridge and you started your meal, and now you say, I want to eat also that. Why not? After all, it was in your fridge. You knew you had this food in your house, so it's included in the meal. Maybe when you said the bracha, the blessing for the bread, you did not have this particular thing in mind. However, it was in your house. It's yours. So you don't have to make another blessing for that. However, if somebody else brought you something from outside your house, you were not completely not thinking about that, definitely you have to make a blessing for that. It is not included in the blessing for the bread. However, this is very interesting. I don't know if it's really common, but whatever. This is what the Alter Rebbe says, and he brings it from the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Sales, the Ashkenazic law authority in the Shulchan Aruch. So he says like this: today, nowadays, people are not so careful with this in these countries, in the Ashkenazic world, Germany and whatever, Eastern Europe, because between us, it's common that somebody sends a present to somebody else in the middle of a meal, even from one house to another. Interesting. I don't know if today it's not so common, but whatever. People used to do that, evidently. People used to do that. 7. Water or any other kinds of liquids, you should not make a blessing within a meal. Even if you're drinking because you're really thirsty, and not just because you want to pass the food. You're thirsty. Even so, you don't make a blessing for the drinking. Why? Because the drink is part of the meal itself. It comes with the meal, so to speak. You can't eat and not drink anything. So, drink is part of the meal. However, number 8, wine, since it has its own blessing, it's an important drink. Even if you drink it within the context of a meal, you still have to make the blessing for the wine. You still have to make the blessing for the wine. Because it's considered a very important drink and so on. Now, if before your meal you drank wine, so suppose you invited somebody to your house, your neighbors or whatever, and people are sitting in your house talking, and you say, let's drink some wine. Okay. So you make the blessing for the wine, and you drink the wine. Everything is fine. And now you say, okay, now let's sit and eat the meal. We drank already a little bit. We're happy. So let's sit and eat. So you bring the bread. So you make the blessing for the bread. And within the meal, you want to continue drinking wine. You don't need to make a blessing because you already made the blessing for the wine before the meal started. Unless you were not thinking at all to drink wine within the meal. So you started drinking wine, and now you're eating your meal, and suddenly you say, why don't we drink wine? Yeah, let's drink. What a good idea. Okay, now you have to make a blessing because you were not thinking about drinking wine within this meal. And now suddenly you want to drink the wine. This applies, number 9, this applies when you make a blessing in the same room where you're eating and you did not leave your place in between. However, if you're eating in a different room or you left your place in between, you have to make another blessing. Unless you drank a certain amount of wine. Over here it says Raviz, which is at 86 milliliters of wine. In that case, you have to make a end blessing in the place where you were eating. So in that case, since you would have to go back to a place where you were eating, you don't make another blessing when you eat in a different place. It's like a whole kinds of rules about this thing of moving from one place to another. The best thing, and it's like that is brought down in the Shulchan Aruch, the best thing is not to leave your place when you're eating. Finish your meal over here, and then you move on to a different meal. That's the best, definitely. Because there are certain cases where if somebody remained in the place, then he's guarding, so to speak. When you come back, you make another blessing. The whole thing, best thing is to start the meal, end the meal, and that's it. And that also helps because when you start moving and doing one thing and another thing, you forget about the end blessing. You end up forgetting. So the best thing is to start the meal, end the meal, and that's it. Needless to say, even though it's not the subject, but since it came to my mind, I'm going to say it now. Needless to say, and this is a very common, and I say this on quotes, sickness between religious Jews. You have to say the blessing in the proper language, in the proper way, with the proper words, and you have to hear what you're saying, like Baruch Atah Hashem. You don't need to spend 3 hours making a blessing. Okay, that's already too much. But pronounce the blessing. People are so used to that and they eat. What did you say? And they eat. That's wrong. Definitely wrong. For the start blessing, end blessing, it doesn't matter which blessing it is. Pronounce the blessing properly. You don't need to scream, but pronounce the blessing properly. Of course, God is listening, and you don't need to talk loudly for God. It's not for God, it's for you. The blessing is for us to be thankful that God gave us this food. So if you say, buh, 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 buh. Imagine somebody comes to your house and gives you $1 million, and you say, instead of thank you so much and giving a hug and say buh, 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 buh. Bye, and you close the door. It's crazy. So that's about the blessings.